All right, let's go ahead and get started here. I think we're right at 1:40. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I have one of the hardest speaking slots of any conference because it's right after a carb-heavy lunch. So if I lose anybody, I'm going to start making people do jumping jacks in your seats. So just fair warning. I'll try to keep it lighthearted, keep this moving a little bit. Let's get some introductions out of the way first, shall we? If I can figure out how to get this going. There we go. My name is Tom Mount. I'm the technology lead at Eastern Standard. It's a digital marketing agency here in Center City. I'm a bit of a closet geek. I do play bass guitar. Nobody has seen me do that, so it can't be confirmed. Generally speaking, Saturday mornings you can find me at Fairmount Park. I have a team that I played rec football with pretty much year-round. So that's another one of my hobbies, just kind of to blow off a little bit of energy and have some good barbecue afterwards. My email and contact information is down there. I'm on Drupal.org as tmountjr. As far as my company is concerned, Eastern Standard, we're a marketing agency based here in Philadelphia, as I said. We have a very collaborative process for all of our projects. We try to mix and match our developers with our designers and our strategists and IA, UX, pretty much all of the 2- and 3-letter acronyms that are available. We have somebody representing that in our division, and we do try to keep everybody mixed up together so that devs can look at something on the design and say, that is a really neat slider that costs probably $5,000. Let's maybe not design something like that. And vice versa, designers can sometimes ask, hey, what's possible? Should we do it this way or should we do it that way? So we try to keep everybody mixed together because we found that generally saves time in the long run. That way our processes are not isolated from, design has no idea what dev is doing, has no idea what IA is doing. So keeping everybody in the same space, working together pretty closely helps catch some of those things before they become problems. And we are hiring right now. We have a table out in the main area. We are looking for developers at all levels, pretty much. We have some openings for some senior folks. We also are starting to look at more junior, mid-level folks as well. We have a couple of our developers here in-house today. I won't point them out. But we have a growing support team as well. So we take on projects that we have either finished in the past and clients need an ongoing support retainer, or sometimes we take on what we call rescue projects where somebody has a site, it's broken, the previous developer is nowhere to be found, they need somebody to help out. So we go on that retainer basis as well. So I'm going to start off this session with a cliche about working smarter, not harder. You've probably heard this before. As developers, we're always looking for the best way to do things. I think that's part of the engineering mindset, is to pick something apart, find out how it works, and put it back together again. Hopefully working better, maybe with 1 or 2 screws left over. That's always a terrifying thought, but sometimes it works. In my role, I'm pretty concerned that my team be able to write good code and do it efficiently. And so over the last couple of years, as I've been going to different camps and cons and meetups and things like that, I've heard bits and pieces that people have said. So, for instance, somebody will be like, oh, you should totally use Lando for local development. I'm like, cool, mental note, go look at Lando. A little bit later, somebody comes back and says, oh, I found this really cool thing called Drupal Console. It's awesome, you should use it. No more context than that. Cool, I'll go look at Drupal Console. I go to Drush, right, or Drush. Is there really
Drush,
It's Drush. Somebody's made a really good argument for Drush because it is the Drupal shell. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. Spaces versus tabs kind of thing. It's not for here.
Spaces.
Yeah.
No.
Side note, I do have one developer at my company who, will absolutely make that. If she feels like the office is not lively enough, she will start that debate with one of our contractors who is tabs only. And she is very much spaces only.
I'm a very frequent offender of no curly braces, but one-line ifs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our technology partner hates ternaries, so we all have our own little.
Yeah.
We have our own quirks as to how these things are supposed to go. But anyway, all that's a free aside. I'm trying to keep you awake here. So we have all these tools that I keep hearing about, and I see cool things that you can do. I read docs. But it took a long time. My very first Drupal 7 project when I started at this company was pretty involved. I'd never really actually used Drupal before, to be honest with you. And my first day, cool, we need a module written. I'm like, great. time to write a module. And I wrote the whole thing by hand. Admin forms, backend, queue workers, the whole 9 yards. It was actually pretty cool, I'll be honest. But I spent so long literally just writing code. And a lot of it was boilerplate code too. So as I go through these things, if I look back now and I look at that module, if I was going to rewrite it, obviously I know the business logic behind it. I could rewrite it a lot faster. But I think even with the tools that I'm going to show you today, none of these tools are new. So if you came in here and you're like, I'm looking for some great new tools, I probably am not going to have anything new for you. What I do hope that you can get out of this, though, is the ability to get some of these tools together in one place and use them in conjunction with each other to really kind of supercharge some rapid module development. So I'm going to start off by doing something that's going to be very slow. And I apologize, but I guarantee you that the setup is going to take a lot longer than the actual work itself. So let's start with a list of things you should already have. I see a lot of laptops in this room. Reasonably sure. How many of you would consider yourselves back-end developers, module developers? All right, cool. So that's most people. I'm assuming then that you probably have a CLI or a terminal or a command prompt or something that you can run tools on a command line. And this being Drupaldelphia and Drupal 8 module development, I'm also going to assume that you have a Drupal 8 project, whether that's something new that you're starting out or whether that's an existing project that you already have that you're ready to go. Yeah, so I would recommend at least 8.5.72 because it seems like we're getting a new security release every week with Drupal. Within 6 months, this very much could be version 72 of 8.5. I don't know. Quick plug for the guys who work at Drupal security. I'm sure that's a very tough job, and they're not getting paid for it. But it has been a rough few weeks. How many of you got caught up in Drupal patching again last week? Yeah. I just got a note from DigitalOcean today that said that one of my droplets that I haven't looked at in 2 years was involved in a DDoS attack somewhere. So that's fun. Forgot about that one to update. But yeah, those security guys have it tough. So anyway, little joke about the versions. Whatever. I'm assuming that you have a Drupal 8 project floating around somewhere that you're ready to bootstrap. So there's probably some tools maybe that you could download. I'm listing Visual Studio here. There was a time that I hated myself for recommending a Microsoft product, but I'll be honest with you, it does just about everything else that PHP Storm might do, and I don't have to pay $90 a year to have it. I was a big Sublime user for a long time. You can use Atom. You can use brackets even. Does anybody use brackets still? Is that still a thing? Something? Yeah. Whatever IDE you have. And I'm just listing VS Code because that's what I develop in day to day. That's what I wrote this presentation for. I have a few extensions that are kind of like my must-haves. There's PHP debug that lets you use XDebug. We're going to talk about that, don't worry. Editor config, doc blogger, CS fixer. None of those things are necessarily required for you to actually write code faster, although it will help you write more beautiful code faster. And probably if you're working with other developers, they might be happy that you're properly documenting and beautifying your code as you go. Some of the things that probably would be good to have, Drupal console, we're going to talk about that. Docker, we'll talk about that, and Lando. Docker and Lando kind of go together. And I just want to point out right here, this is not the only thing. This is not a must-have, like you can only use these things in conjunction. For the most part, you can use Docker and Lando just help you get a local development environment. If you have your own local development environment, that's cool. Use it. If you have your own IDE that you want to use, that's cool too. I'm just telling you what I'm using as I'm going through this. The principles that I'm going to show you in this presentation are probably pretty easily extended to other tools that you might use. As far as this goes, quick note at the bottom, the only one I'm going to be actually using out of this list of plugins for VS Code is PHP debug. So there's probably a few more things that I bet you probably already have. If you're an established Drupal developer already working, you probably have Git installed on your laptop. Most likely you have Composer installed, maybe globally, maybe not. You probably have Drush somewhere. It might be global. It might be built into the project. If you're using Drush 9, it's probably already in the project because I think that's the only way you can use it. Drush 8 may be installed globally, maybe installed locally for a project. It really is just a matter of preference at this point. So there is some one-time setup that we're going through, right? So you got to install all this stuff. Now that I've listed, you got to install VS Code, you can install Docker, install Lando, install the console launcher. It's probably not going to take you more than 10 minutes to do this. What probably, let's be honest with ourselves, takes the longest time is setting up your IDE just the way you want it, right? You gotta get the color schemes right, you gotta get your extensions installed. But don't worry, this is all a one-time cost. Once you have all this set up, you can go back to this and you can skip most of these steps because you've already got everything installed, everything's running just fine. So now you're probably asking, can we actually get to the module development? I talk about rapid module development, and I spent about 10 minutes talking about the tools that you would need to start this. So I imagine people are probably itching to get with the developing. Well, before we can develop, we got to know what we actually want to do, right? So having a clear idea of what you want your module to accomplish it may seem like an obvious first step, but think about it for a second. The Drupal module ecosystem is pretty big. There's a couple thousand modules out there. If you spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, even half an hour Googling what you want to do and seeing if there's a Drupal module out there, you may have saved yourself 40 to 60 hours of development time just by finding that you're not going to reinvent the wheel. And I can't overstate that enough because I see it a lot in stuff that we do and stuff that some of our contracting partners do, is this constant not invented here, or I didn't actually know that this was a thing. And I'll be honest with you, I've done it myself too, because I'm only 2 years into the Drupal ecosystem. I've only really used it for about that long. So when I started, I was coming from the world of Laravel, right, where you build everything yourself. And I'm like, cool, we need this functionality, let me just build this. We need that functionality, I'm gonna go build that. And then finally my boss took me aside and said, there's a module that does that, right? I'm like, cool, well, that could save me a week of time. So let's make that our first lesson in efficiency, right? It's not necessarily about doing things quickly, it's being smart in your approach. Has somebody already done this for me? If yes, can I use what they've built? Maybe not, maybe you can. Maybe you can take what they've built and modify it for your own needs. In either event, you've saved a lot of time by having to write a lot of code yourself by going with something that somebody else has written. So don't discount that initial step of mapping out what you want to do and then researching to see if somebody's already done it. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to go through and create a really simple module. Okay, so this module is going to have configuration. It's going to store it the way that other Drupal modules store their configuration. It's going to have a form to edit whatever configuration values we have. We need a way to get to that form, so we're going to put something on the menu that lets us access our form. And then we're going to have some kind of permission that your site owners can set for who should be able to access this form. Now, your custom module is probably going to be more than this. The one that I'm going to show you here is, well, it's really, it doesn't do much. But it just demonstrates the principles that we're going to be using as we go through. So let's actually get started. So let's go set up our site. So I've got this, I don't know if it'll play, yeah, it's playing pretty well. You can never tell when you go into these presentations if your slides that play these animated GIFs are going to work well and if it's going to be readable. And by the way, all these slides will be available after the conference has concluded. You'll be able to download and see these things going up. So right now, I'm literally installing Drupal from scratch. I grabbed 8.5.3. Just a quick thing about there's a lot of files in there. I think it's somewhere like 3 or 4 times larger than Drupal 7. But essentially, I'm just creating a folder for Drupal core, and then I'm installing Drupal into a subfolder of that. And then I'm moving it to a folder that I'm called doc root. So as I'm going through this presentation, I'll talk about your doc root. That's actually going to be one of the folders inside the folder we're creating for our module project. And then I'm just installing Lando, which I think got cut off at the end of this one. This was like a 53 meg GIF. I'm not even kidding. GIF. I stumbled onto another one.
No, I was just going to say it too. The worst was when I heard a professor call it a ping, not a PNG. I think that was the worst.
That's, yeah. So we're doing Lando. We're doing Lando init. There's a command in here. You can actually bootstrap a Drupal 8 right from scratch with Lando. And it'll give you some sane defaults. And then the next thing I'm going to do here after I finish installing Drupal is my Lando file. Now Lando, just to give you a quick background on it, it's based on Docker, which is a container solution. The defaults for Lando will give you a web server and a database server, free of charge, just right off the bat. There's only a few changes that you have to make. So when this file started its life as a new file, all it had was webroot : docroot. I added the final 4 lines there to make sure that we're using PHP 7.1. I say that we're using Composer to manage Drush. I want XDebug turned on, and I want Drupal console. That's what Drupal, that last line there. I want Drupal console to be installed and available via Lando. And then I run Lando start. So it'll bring it up. It'll go through installing Drupal, and this process, we talk about rapid development. I did this for a new project this morning. It took about 10 minutes to install Drupal. The more modules you have to install, the longer it takes. Probably because there was 1,000 other things running on my laptop, it also took a long time for that. So your mileage may vary on how long it takes Drupal to actually install. The good news is, if you already have Drupal installed somewhere, you probably won't have to go through that process. If you can grab a database and import it, you're golden. I'm not going to really cover that in this session. We're kind of getting to the point, remember this is step 0, we just want to get to the point where we can start doing our work. And there's a couple other commands that I ran too. I ran Composer install, I required Drush and Drupal console via Lando. Just some basic bootstrapping things. So we're now, if we say that, okay, cool, we have all that done, now we have our site, now we can actually get to the point where we're doing rapid module development. All that was kind of setting up the groundwork. So let's create our module. And we're going to use a tool called Drupal console for this. Drupal console allows you to, it's a Symfony app that you can install with Drupal. And it allows you to do command line access to do a lot of things. There are many, many, many commands that you can run. In this case, we're going to use one called generate module, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to do Lando Drupal generate : module. And it's going to walk me through a wizard. It's going to ask me for a module name, which I'm just going to call at this point custom config values. Real good module name there, right? Anytime you see me not enter anything, I'm just taking the defaults. So module path, machine name, maybe give it a description rather than my awesome module, unless it really is an awesome module, in which case by all means leave it. The package name just lets you know where it shows up in the module list. Drupal core you can leave the same. You do want a .module file. You don't want it as a feature. You do want to add a composer JSON. In this case, I am specifying dependencies, other things that have to be there for this module to run, which in this case is going to be menu UI and path. We wanted to generate a test case, and I spoke too slow. So let me go back and look at my notes. We want to generate a unit test class. Unit testing is another thing that's outside the scope of this. You should totally do it. I'm going to be one of those guys that I talked about at the top, like, oh, you should totally do this, and not give you any more context. Do unit testing. In this case, it'll give you something that's basically, when I enable this module, does my site load or does it error out? Which is pretty cool. That's the quickest way to find out if your module is going to break Drupal, is that test right there. It'll keep you from pushing it to production and breaking your site. It'll also ask if you want to generate a template, which we don't in this case. And then it'll ask to proceed with the operation. We say yes. Let it catch back up to me. And then it generates 4 files. So those files are kind of the core of how Drupal modules work. So there's going to be a module file. There's going to be a couple of YAML files that you probably aren't going to need to touch right off the bat. Essentially, you can just kind of let it go at this point. You can take a look and see what the files are, but you really don't have to do much with your custom module because Drupal did it all for us. And the cool thing is, this config module that we created, this module that we created, that's just like the container for everything. We haven't put anything in it. So if you enable it, nothing will happen on your site. But cool, like we just wrote 400 lines of code in about, 30 seconds, a minute, tops. And we've saved a lot of time already. So my first module experience that I wrote, I had to write all of it by hand, and I copied somebody else's, just kind of like seeing what they did, writing my own. Probably took an hour for me to like truly understand what I was doing. With this, 30 seconds. Now you have a module. I'm going to throw this in here, just a step that I like to do in this process, just to kind of make things a little bit easier to organize my modules. No screenshot, or no animation here, just screenshots of what I did. In a nutshell, what I did was I moved that module that it created out of the module's custom directory, which is where the console installed it. I put it as a sibling folder to that doc.root folder that we talked about. And then I symlinked it back in. That way, it still appeared to be there as far as Drupal was concerned. But the advantage of doing it this way is I can now run git init inside my module and start git init without having to worry about, maybe I cloned down my repo, my Drupal 8 site from somewhere else. Can do git init inside a module that's already been git initted, or whatever the phrase is there. So you can't have two gits running inside each other. Just now, you can do git submodules, you can do git subtrees. Yes, that's all fine, but that's a little bit crazy to deal with. We have a couple subtree and submodule workflows. It's not really fun. But if you move this module out, you can do a git init. You can start up a git. You don't have to use a remote. You can just literally have just git in there so you can track your changes. And if you symlink it back in, all that will stay put. You can still use git inside your main Drupal repo. You can also use git inside this folder. No submodules, no subtrees, none of that fun stuff. So that's just a quick side note. It's kind of my preference for doing this, but not necessarily required. So, for you who have enabled modules before, show of hands. I've enabled a module in my lifetime. How do you do it normally?
Drush en module.
I got drush. Any other ways people do it?
Also the UI.
There is the UI. I'm a big believer in, if your hands are already on the keyboard, keep them on the keyboard. Believe it or not, like, time yourself throughout the day. The time you pick your hand up off the keyboard to find a mouse, and then click, and then put your hand back on the keyboard, it adds up. So enabling the module with this method is super simple. Since we're in Lando, we use Lando drush en-y custom config values, and Lando spins a little bit because my machine's a little bit slow today. And we're done. Literally, that's it. In the config interface, you would have gone to configuration, or extend rather, and then you would have had to scroll and find your module, click the checkbox, scroll again to find the save configuration button, click the save button, wait for it to reload. Here, you just type in a quick command and you're done.
Akin to maintenance mode via drush, right?
What's that?
Akin to maintenance mode?
Yes.
Drush.
Yes. So, I mean, you could click around in the menu, but why would you when you have the keyboard right in front of you and you're already using it?
Right.
This is probably the biggest lift of the task so far, now, is generating the config file and form. Here again, we're talking lines of code in the order of hundreds that you would probably have to write out yourself if there was not a handy-dandy Drupal console command to do it for you. Will this video actually work? This was the thing, maybe, possibly. Yes! This was a worry of mine last night. It was not working. Yep. I'm sorry, gotta find my mouse next. Which side of the screen is my mouse on? All right. No video. You can download the presentation and see it. Essentially, what it's asking right now, we're going to use drush generate. What's it? Generate :form :config. So Drupal generate form. Drupal generate will give you a list of all of the many things that you can generate with the Drupal console. You can also generate various types of forms. One of those forms is a config form. And what this does for you, not only does it give you a form, it also gives you a config YAML file that matches the kind of things that you want to track in your form. So when you create your form, it's going to ask you, what module do you want to install this in? So you give it your custom config values, module name. Next thing it's going to ask you is for a class name and a form ID, which those are usually fine. It has this cool thing. Drupal 8 has a somewhat advanced concept called something that I didn't write down and now is not immediately in mind. Dependency injection. Thank you. So with Drupal 8 services, you can inject those services directly into your module so that you don't have to, like, new config manager or new entity, whatever. You don't have to do any of that. You can tell Drupal, go grab an instance of this out of the container and give it to me. Here's where you would do that. It'll actually ask you if you want to pull in any services from the container. If you say yes, with this console, you can actually autocomplete, use the up and down arrow keys to cycle through a list of things that it's already autocompleted for you. You can find your services that you want to pull out of the container, and say, I want these services available in my module, and it'll do all of the configuration for you. That probably took me an hour to figure out to do how by hand, just that part of it, the first time I did it. So something like this, where it's like, cool, you want these out of this container? Let me give you a list of things that are in the container, and then you can choose them. Pretty great. It'll even ask you if you want to generate a form structure. How many of you have used Drupal's form API, either 7 or 8 before? How many of you enjoyed using Drupal's form API? Wow. We have some brave souls in here. I came from the world of front page originally, right? It's like, I want my text box on the page, so you drag the text box. Visual Basic was the same way.
Wow.
So,
Next,
thank you.
next you'll say go live.
No, I'm not going to go there. So, I'm coming from the realm of, I have to go actually now create an array of, like, I want this to be a text field, and I want these options to be set. I got to type all that out. That's time consuming. This one, do we have it up on here? Unfortunately, we have just the tail end of it. Basically, I say, here's the field names I want. I want a field name called API URL. And it says, cool, here's the machine name for that field. You want it to be a text field, 64 characters long, done. Literally all it was. I just accepted, for the most part, I think, what did I do? 3 things I had to type in here out of about 10 different options that I just took the defaults for the rest of them. And now I have a form that gives me a text box.
What command did you run?
This is Drupal generate :form:config.
Do you have that?
It's in the. So I generated this thing. It also gives me a routing path. Drupal 8 routing, if you've never done it before, can be a little intimidating. This thing just created the routing file for me and gave me, here's your new path to access this form. It even gives me a menu link on this. So the hour that I spent figuring out Drupal 8's routing, and then another hour that I spent, more like 2, trying to figure out how to get the menu structure working correctly, this does it for me in 2 clicks of a keyboard. It's fantastic. And it created 4 files for me. It created the routing file, it created the actual form file itself, it created the YAML file that it's going to use to store the configuration, and it created a menu config file as well. All of these things just get dumped right into your module folder, and away you go.
Quick question.
Question, yes?
Does this support Drupal 7?
This does not, unfortunately, support Drupal 7. This is a Drupal 8 only thing. I apologize for that.
No, not your fault.
So what I do want to show you is what this looks like on the front end. So I fired this up. Remember, my module is already enabled. So I found this thing in the menu, and I loaded it up. Here's my API URL text box. I type in some sort of text. I say save, and it saves it. So let's verify that this actually works. Real quick test, right? Drupal 8's configuration is all stored in YAML files. It's pretty great. You can also export single YAML files from the UI, or even just take a look at it, which is what we're going to do here. So I pulled up the config export. I went to single item. I found my config value. You see it's custom config values.custom config, just like I told it I wanted it to be. And there was one value in there. It's the API URL. It's set to hello world, just like I told you in the text box. Just a quick verification that we're done. Now at this point, since I'm running Git in my module, I'll probably commit all my changes just so I have a point in time reference. So if I really mess things up, I can go back and fix it. Reset whatever I need to, and try again. So is that it? Well, my clock says 28 minutes, so that's a pretty short presentation. I mean, we could stop here, right? I showed you, in short form, how to come up with a config form. You probably caught 600 lines of code condensed into about real time, probably 10 minutes of work to generate this. You didn't have to type but maybe 1 paragraph worth of information if you were to type it all out at the same time. The thing is, the form does ask for an API URL, right? And I typed in hello world, and it's like, cool. Any say problem with that? Let's go fix the fact that our API URL field will literally accept anything we put in there, even a blank string. Let's do some validation. Now, unfortunately, I can't actually add validation with the Drupal console. I know you guys were like, I'm doing Drupal console for this, Drupal console for that. Like add validation, Drupal console form validation, add URL. No, it doesn't really work that way. But where we can kind of get around some of that is if we have XDebug set up. How many of you guys have heard of XDebug, used XDebug? For those of you who have not, it's about a 50-50 split. For those of you who have not, XDebug is the best profiler and debugging tool for PHP that I have ever come across. It allows you to do things like putting breakpoints in your code, which means that if I set line 49 and say stop at line 49, it'll execute line 48 and then it'll stop. And your website will just sit there hanging, waiting for something to happen. And you can see what will happen when you go to line 49. You can look at variables. You can say, like, what does this form value actually say it is in the system? You can guess all day long. And in fact, prior to using XDebug, this would be a case where I'd be putting out statements to dump a variable onto the screen and die. Var dump and die, var dump and die, all day long, hammering the server, reload, reload, reload. That's really time consuming. Here, I can say, stop at this line, don't go any further until I've had a chance to look at things. I can say, oh, I'm using the wrong method, or I'm looking at the wrong variable. And the thing is, it's actually, I say it's fairly easy to set up in VS Code. It took me a while to figure out how to set up in VS Code, let's be honest here. Thankfully, now that I have it figured out, it's pretty quick to set up. So, essentially what you all have to do in VS Code, and again, this is going to be different in Sublime versus Atom versus anything else. But within VS Code, there's a debug menu. You click debug, you go to open configurations, you choose PHP as the configuration type, and it gives you this file, minus this path mappings thing at the very bottom. This is the secret sauce to making it all work. XDebug has to know if you're working on a remote system, what the path on the remote system is. In this case, it's /app/custom-config values, where that folder is actually located locally in Visual Studio's point of view. So that's where that workspace root /custom-config values comes in. Same thing for the doc root. In Lando, it's being served out of /app/doc root. In VS Code, that's actually workspace root, which is just what I've opened up, that folder that I've opened up in VS Code, /doc root. So those things are super critical, and if you get those wrong, your XDebug simply will not fire. That took me a long time to get that squared away. That was buried in some pull request on GitHub from 2016. I don't know why it wasn't better documented. But there it is. You can get the slide deck later. Take a look at the example. This will save you time, I guarantee it. We have a question, yes?
I actually want to make a quick suggestion. So a lot of times when I'm doing development, I like to do it on the development server because it most mirrors production. There's actually a module for Drupal called object log, and you can literally just object log a variable at any state.
Okay, yeah, the debug has a similar tool on there that lets you actually spit out variable information into a separate, not on the screen, but into a separate into a database log that lets you view it on screen.
I can log an object and get all the different things inside that object.
Yeah.
I just think that's easier because I know, like you said, XDebug can sometimes be hell to set up.
It can be, and it can be a little overwhelming too if you don't know what you're looking for. And I do have a link, actually it's in my notes on this slide. I don't have it on the slide itself. I have a link for a really good overview of what you can do with XDebug and how to get along. But yeah, let me know afterwards. Come up and let me just get that back from you because I'd like to look into that as well.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So this is a screenshot of what XDebug is looking like in VS Code as I'm stopped on this line of code. So you see I took line 49. It's the only line in the validate form method. So I'm figuring this is probably something to do with my form validation. It's saying it wants to validate a form using two variables. There's form and there's form state. So you'll see at the very top there's that little green arrow with a couple other blue arrows next to it, a little green circle saying you want to restart your debugging, and a stop button, which is basically bring the entire app to a crashing halt right here. Just a quick look at what it looks like when you're going through this debugging. So if I stop on this in my validation, and on my front end of my code, I tell it to go submit some form of text in my configuration, and it stops on this validation. As I'm looking down here, I see this submit form method has this form state, get value, API URL. So I'm like, what is that value actually supposed to be? So I put it in my watch window, and I literally just copied and pasted into my watch window. and it evaluates whatever statement, whether it's a variable or a function, it evaluates that and drops it in as the result. So you see that what it's evaluating is in purple on the side, and then the output is in that brownish, orangish, whatever color that is on the screen. And we can see that when I typed in hello world with a couple of exclamation marks, that is the value that it wants to save. That's the value that it needs to validate. That's what I'm sending in. That's what I need to make sure is a valid URL, which obviously right now it's not. So what I'm going to do is on here, I'm just going to tell it to go ahead and continue debugging. So let's talk about debugging and validating a URL. Back in the day, everybody used to have their own regular expression that validated an email address. There were 50,000 of them. They were all wrong. There was always edge cases. Everybody was fighting about whose email validator was better. URLs the same way. There's a zillion things in URLs. This only works for HTTP. This doesn't work for FTP. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So when we talk about, remember back at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned about, not reinventing the wheel. Maybe somebody else has done this. Literally, I just Googled Drupal 8 valid URL. The first thing that popped up is a helper class called URL helper that has a method called isValid. Well, that's cool. I even included a link on the documentation page. It's been in Drupal 8 since there was a Drupal 8. And it's a pretty easy signature. You pass it a URL, and it gives you a true or false back. Awesome. I don't have to worry about whether I have the right URL validator. I just give it this thing. This is the URL validator that Drupal uses. And that's another thing, is you're doing Drupal module development. Drupal has a lot of stuff built in that you can just kind of hook into, that you may not necessarily have to come up with solutions yourself. Somebody's already done it. So this is a case where that is the case. Somebody's already figured out how to validate URLs. I just got to find the method to do it. So the next tool I want to talk to you about is we're going to test this using what they call a REPL, R-E-P-L. Read, execute, print, loop is what it stands for. This was probably not exaggerating when I say life-changing for me when I discovered this. I've used REPLs before. There are online ones that you can use to test code out. I had no idea there was one specific for Drupal that would bootstrap Drupal for you and let you run stuff. It's called Drush PHP. It comes built into Drush. If you've never used this before, you will thank me later. Drush PHP, when you start it up, will give you a PHP environment, and then will spin up Drupal in that environment. So you can do things like Drupal component utility URL helper is valid and give it something, and it'll spit out the results of that. You don't have to init Drupal. You don't have to do anything. This may look pretty simply, like, okay, whatever. You could easily figure out if isValid is going to work. Just try debugging an entity query that is giving you weird results without using something like this. Oh, man. This has been a huge time saver. I introduced this to my team a few weeks ago, and I've got folks using it frequently to help them debug, like, why is this Drupal thing not working? In this case, it's a really simple example just for a really simple module, but I think it demonstrates the power of what Drush console will actually let you do. Running Drupal inside a little shell. Used to be, I would actually have to create a separate form or a route in a module that its sole purpose in life was to execute one line of code and print the results to the page. Wow. This thing, by the way, I'm gonna tell on myself here. I spent 3 hours a few months ago with one of those custom module, one route, dump things out on the page, trying to figure out why it wasn't working. Turns out I hadn't enabled the module. It's 5 o'clock Thursday afternoon, everyone's tired. So this kind of thing will save you from that kind of an embarrassment. Trust me, this is an amazing thing. So what I've demonstrated here, I put 2 commands. www.google.com/foobar. It's a valid URL. That doesn't go anywhere. Well, it may actually search for foobar depending on how Google has things set up, but it's not an actual URL. But it's formatted like one, and that's all I really care about. However, hello world is not formatted like a URL. So as we would expect, this returns true for validly formatted things and false for ones that are not. So real quick, there's a lot of development happening here. I basically just gave you the code that I'm using. I use this method against the value that I just submitted, and I save that as a true or false value. And then I say if it's false, tell the form that that particular API URL control has an error, and give it a quick message. So what does that look like? Well, here if I try typing in hello world and save my config, that's not a valid URL. But if I tell it to use google.com/foobar, thumbs up, worked just fine. So that's how we added our validation to the form. Now, granted, we didn't use a snappy little one-liner on the command line to do it, but we were able to use XDebug to save us the pain of having to dump out that entire form state, or even knowing whether it was form or form state. That was the other thing. Like, which variable are you going to dump out? Hope you get the right one, or you got to reload. So, using XDebug and just stopping there and just saying, like, tell me everything that you have in your stack right now. Let me take a look. Oh, that's the value I need. Cool, we're going to go with that. So the last thing, add permissions. Maybe you don't always do this on modules, but again, I wanted to show you because Drupal console has a couple things that are pretty cool here too. So maybe you have a larger site, maybe there's content editors and site admins, and maybe you don't want your content editor to go changing the URL of the API that you're using to fetch data. That's a pretty common use case. So you want to have a permission set up so that only certain people or groups of people can do that. We can do that. So let's go back into our Docker folder. We're going to run the program called Drupal generate:permissions. And this will ask you for the module in which you want to place these permissions. You can give it some quick information about the name and the information that you're trying to do. And 15 frames a second later, a little description. It'll ask you if you want to actually restrict access to only specific users. That'll put a little warning on your permission. And then you tell it done, and it generates one file, which is usually about 5-6 lines. But you have to look up the permissions API and actually read what it does to write that yourself, or you could use console to do it for you. So it defines the permission, doesn't really enforce it. In that menu file, that's using that routing file that we created way back when, 20 minutes ago, with our Drupal form generate command, it had a permission. That permission was access administrative content. So basically any administrator could access this form. So we're just going to change that to change API information, the one that we just created. And now we've told this form, only people that have that particular access right can go to my form. So let's test this real quick, right? Because we're administrators, we can do anything on the site, for better or for worse. There's a little bit of command line food that I like to use. If you type just Drupal by itself, it spits out this massive long list of all the commands you can run. I don't really want to know all the commands. I just want to know ones that deal with roles, right? So I used a pipe, and I said grep role, and it only shows me output for the lines that have that word in it. So I see that there's this create roles, I see debug roles, I see role delete, role new, I see a user role. So I'm just going to run that debug roles, because that tells me that it will display the current roles for my application. And I see that there's only one role as the administrator. That's built into Drupal. Yeah, everybody have that. So I wanted to create roles. It asks me, how many would you like to create? I say, just one, please. And it spits out this randomly named one. This one's actually pronounceable. In some testing of this, it came up with ones that definitely were not pronounceable. So we just, created a role. Again, you could do that in the UI through clicking around the people and add new role and typing in things, but you could also just generate one on the fly. The other thing that we can do is create a test user. Again, something you could do on the UI, but you're already at your keyboard, so why not keep using your keyboard? It's going to ask you a username, and then pretty much after that you can, it'll ask you a password, you can skip that. You tell it to use the role that you just created, and then user email and status, don't need to change any of those. It'll give you a new ready-to-roll user based on what you just created that you can then log in. One other cool thing that was something that we use, especially our support team uses this all the time. What's the administrative password for your site? I don't know. Cool. Drush has a thing called user login, otherwise known as ULI. If you just do Drush ULI, it logs you in as admin. one cool thing you can do is you can actually tell the user that you want to log in as. So I say, here's this perm test user that I created. I want to log in as this guy. And it'll give you a one-time use link that you can use to log in. So basically, I'm just going to take that link, everything after the user reset link, and I'm going to go to a new incognito window in Chrome. I'm going to give it the URL that I'm actually working on and then paste the rest of that link in. Now I can be logged into the same site in 2 different browser windows. You could use Chrome and Firefox as well, whichever you'd like. So to test this, in my permissions, we've got right now that my custom config values, that user group, that Cressus, whatever, that group is not selected. So when I try to access that page as my test user, I'm not authorized to access. Cool, working like we should. So what if I went into and said, you know what, let that group use this API information permission. I check it, I save it, I go back to my site, I reload, there we go. So with, again, just a couple types on the keyboard, I've created a permission, I've applied it to my module, made a real quick code change in my module file, and then I use a few other command line utilities to switch back and forth between 2 windows to test whether or not that permission actually worked. In this case, thankfully, it does. Now that's it. So let's quickly recap, right? How is this actually faster? I told you this was rapid module development. Instead of setting up Pantheon or Aqua or some other local dev tool, committing code, testing, commit, test, commit, test, commit, test, we've all done that. What we can do is just use a local development environment. We use Lando here. You can really use whatever you'd like. Instead of going through the Form API menu docs, writing a couple hundred lines of code by hand, reading up some blogs on how to set up configuration files, writing some more code by hand, we can use Drupal console to give us a brand new module, set up a config file, create an editing form, and even set up permissions. Instead of clicking around in the admin interface for a while to create users, create roles, we can also use the Drupal console to give us a new role and a new user right off the command line. Instead of, when we create that user, choosing a password, writing it down, cluttering up our password managers and our brains, we can use Drush and a private browsing window to log in as that new user. I don't care what the password is. I will say, by the way, don't put those kinds of users in production. Just throwing that out there. Make sure you clean up your users before you launch your site. This is a nice one. Instead of using var dump and die everywhere, or if you really want to use the develop module, you can use kint everywhere. But you always have to reload the page before you change anything, and you got to know what you're actually kinting out to begin with. You can use an IDE and a debugging tool to look at your values one time, figure out what you need, and get a little bit of insight into how Drupal is running things under the hood. And then doing something silly like creating an existing route or a new route that it really just runs one statement and dumps things out. You can use Drush's PHP environment, their little spun up REPL, to test out some inputs against a Drupal utility that you know is there, without having to guess or go the long way around for this stuff. So, in conclusion, as I said before, the things that I was talking about here today are not specific. They don't depend on the tools that I showed you. You can use whatever IDE you want. You can use whatever local dev you want. Those are just my preferences. That is what I've found works best for me. If something else works best for you, by all means use it. There's plenty of resources about how to use XDebug in whatever IDE you want. There are probably literal wars being fought over what the best local development environment is. I don't really have an opinion for you. That is what's worked best for me. You can use whatever you like. But I really hope that more than just betraying my preference for local development stuff, I hope that you have found some ways to maybe use these tools together to give you a little bit more of a quick way to start up module development within Drupal 8. Anybody have any questions? I feel like I just turned on the fire hydrant. Let you all have it. Cool. Well, I will be around here for a little while after. If you have any things that you want to mention, bring up. These slides will be available, as well as the presentation, on Drupaldelphia's site soon, hopefully. Should be within a couple days, maybe a week. And I'll have these slides uploaded to the presentation page for like this page this presentation has a page on Drupaldelphia. I will upload the slides and any other related links and materials that I have throughout the slide deck. If you have any questions, my contact information is in the slide deck. It's also on this thing. Feel free to reach out and email me. So yeah, thank you guys.